In the summer of 1949, something broke the stillness of Clervion, Illinois. A quiet township seemingly left behind by time. Nestled between a stretch of forgotten fields and a dense line of sycamore and oak, the town never quite joined the modern world. It had no more than 500 residents, one general store, a schoolhouse with peeling white paint, and a sheriff's office that doubled as a post office. It was a place where news traveled slowly, and people preferred to whisper rather than write. On the morning of June 6, 1949, the air was thicker than usual. The cornfields were unusually silent. Birds, typically loud and quarrelsome at that hour, were absent. Mrs. Adele Harmon, who had lived on the western edge of town for over 4 decades, noted the stillness first. Her clock had stopped at precisely 5:23 in the morning. No mechanical issue was found. It simply refused to move. That same day, a boy named Peter Harrow, age 9, did not return home after helping his father deliver milk crates around the outskirts of the township. His bike was found leaned neatly against the low fence of the Blanchard property. His cap was hanging from the handlebars. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints besides his own, and no witnesses. The Blanchards hadn't seen or heard anything. They'd been inside the house, waiting out the unusual heat. Local law enforcement, consisting solely of Sheriff Byron Klein and his deputy, Louis March, opened a missing persons file. But in Clervion, there had never been a need for such procedures. The boy's disappearance was the first recorded case of its kind in town. Flyers were hand-drawn. The sheriff's Ford was used to drive up and down the gravel roads, knocking on doors. Nothing. 8 days later, on June the 14th, 11-year-old Mary Sullivan went missing from the rear of the churchyard after choir practice. Her hymnal was found lying open, damp from the dew. Reverend Charles Winsley, who had locked up the church that evening, reported no disturbances. He remembered seeing her walk toward the back path that led to her family's house. She was humming. She never arrived. The Sullivans were devout. Mary was their only child. Her mother, Catherine, refused to leave the porch for 3 days. Her father, Thomas, paced the woods with a lantern long after the authorities had ended their nightly search. Again, no signs, no clothes, no blood, not even a broken branch. Just the same silence that had blanketed the town since the first week of June. By the time the 3rd child vanished, panic was no longer beneath the surface. On June 21st, 10-year-old Isaac Monroe disappeared behind the general store while helping his uncle stack sacks of grain. He was gone less than 3 minutes. The sacks remained undisturbed. His footprints led to the back alley, then stopped. Sheriff Klein noted in his log, "As if the earth had swallowed him whole." That was the phrase that appeared in the Clervion Herald the next morning, one of the few local papers still hand-typeset by William Creel, who claimed he hadn't needed to add a headline that week. The town was already in a grip of tension. Whispers of superstition began to stir. Older residents remembered the stories of the Potawatomi and Kickapoo tribes, whose burial mounds were said to be scattered in the dense forest east of the township. Long before the land was parceled and sold, there had been fires, strange lights above the riverbank, and reports of white-eyed spirits seen during summer storms. These were never documented formally, just stories passed down from settlers who had built their homes too close to the tree line and moved away before the century turned. But others offered a different theory. In late May, a traveling carnival, the sort that never had a name or poster, had passed through Clervion. It stayed only for one evening. There were no rides, only tents. A strange organ played without a visible musician. Locals remembered a tall man with a painted face who walked with a silver cane. Children were drawn to the flickering lights, though many parents forbade them from entering the grounds. The carnival vanished by morning. No one saw the carriages leave. Sheriff Klein submitted a formal inquiry to state authorities about the group, requesting any information on itinerant performers or unauthorized circuses traveling through southern Illinois. No records existed. The inquiry was returned with a note. No permits filed, no known operations matching the description. Deputy March found this deeply unsettling. He began re-interviewing families who had attended the carnival. Most had dismissed it, considering it a brief oddity. But one woman, Julia Merrill, recounted something peculiar. Her daughter had spoken of a girl made of light who danced in the field behind the candy stand. She claimed the girl spoke in riddles and asked her to come walk between the rows. Julia had thought it was imagination until the disappearances began. In the following weeks, Sheriff Klein began cataloging unusual reports in a separate journal. He didn't include them in the official logbook. He called it Anomalies, Summer 49. Entries included the following. June 12th. Unidentified, high-pitched whistling heard near the Monroe residence. No source located. June 14th. 3 separate reports of figures in the cornfield at dusk. Not scarecrows. Movement witnessed. Dissipated upon approach. June 17. Entire section of woods fell silent for over 30 minutes. No birds, no insects. Confirmed by local hunter, Edwin Parks. The strangest entry came on June 23rd. Mrs. Harmon brought in a tin box wrapped in cloth, found buried beneath her back porch. Inside, a set of hand-carved dolls, 3 in number, one missing its head. None belonged to her or her late husband. She claims they were not there before last week. By early July, search efforts had ceased. A meeting was held at the old schoolhouse. Sheriff Klein spoke plainly. We are either dealing with a madman or something beyond our understanding. He was voted out of office that autumn. Clervion was never the same. Families moved. Children were kept indoors. The school shut down that winter from lack of attendance. The town began to fall into disrepair, slowly, silently, as if it too had become infected by something old and unseen. The files were closed. The case, marked unsolved, was archived in a rusted cabinet in the new sheriff's department in Danvers County. No new evidence was submitted, but the name Clervion remained a stain, a whispered reminder to nearby townships of that summer when the children vanished and the fields grew too quiet. By the winter of 1953, the official story of Clervion had been neatly folded away, buried beneath layers of rural bureaucracy and fading memory. But in the basement of the Danvers County Hall of Records, behind a row of rusted filing cabinets that had not been touched since the early 50s, sat a beige box with no official case number. It was labeled simply, Clervion, Children, Summer 49. The folder inside smelled of mildew and dry paper. The ink had begun to fade, but the content had not. 36 years later, in 1985, Joseph Mallory, a freelance writer and son of former Deputy Louis March, stumbled across the box while assisting in the digitization of county archives. Mallory had grown up in Danvers, but remembered his father's odd silences whenever the topic of Clervion came up. His father had died in '72. The house he left behind contained no mention of the town, not even a single clipping. But Joseph had always remembered one thing, the way his father never let him near the woods alone. Joseph began to dig. What started as a passing curiosity quickly became an obsession. He read every clipping, each handwritten note, the reports, and especially Sheriff Klein's separate journal of anomalies. But it wasn't until he reached out to the Illinois State Historical Society that he uncovered something that had never been formally tied to the case. A police sketch dated August 19th, 1949, drawn by a rural constable from Carlisle, located roughly 40 miles south of Clervion. The drawing depicted a man seen traveling northward with a cart full of broken musical instruments. His face was thin, elongated. A crescent-shaped scar crossed his left eye. The man reportedly avoided contact, but children had been seen approaching his wagon near the roadside. The report had been misfiled under theft, property, agricultural tools. The instruments were never recovered. Joseph traced a route between Carlisle and Clervion using local road maps from the time. Along the way, he found 3 other incidents, not of disappearances, but of unexplained phenomena. In the township of Vespers Hollow, 5 scarecrows were discovered repositioned into a circle overnight. In Mill Creek, a farmer reported all the glass in his home, windows, picture frames, lantern covers, had shattered simultaneously just before dawn. None of these incidents made it into statewide news, but they followed a path, always north, always toward Clervion. In the spring of 1986, Joseph interviewed Adele Harmon, then 91 years old. Living in a care home in Quincy, her mind was mostly intact. When asked about the summer of '49, she grew still. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It came through the ground," she said. "I saw it. Not a man, not an animal. It knew where to find them." When asked what it was, she only replied, "It's not gone, just quiet." Joseph recorded every interview he could. Catherine Sullivan, mother of Mary, refused to speak, but neighbors said she still set a place for her daughter at supper. Thomas Sullivan had taken his life in 1952. No note. The Reverend Charles Winsley had been transferred to a mental health facility in 1955 after a public breakdown during service. He claimed he had heard voices in the walls of the church calling out the children's names. Joseph published a small article in a regional journal under a pseudonym. It was largely dismissed. Rural superstitions, they said, invented memory, trauma taking shape as folklore. But he knew what he had read. The dolls in the tin box, the sketches, Sheriff Klein's log of glowing figures in the fields, and the most disturbing note, a single entry dated June 25th, written in rushed, slanted handwriting. "Third bell, heard again last night, metallic, coming from beneath the Monroe property." This line drew Joseph back to Clervion itself, now practically abandoned. Fewer than 70 residents remained. Most homes stood boarded up. The schoolhouse was gutted by fire in 1963. The church was silent, its cross removed after a lightning strike split the steeple. The forest on the town's eastern boundary had grown thicker. Nature had reclaimed what man forgot. Joseph received permission to visit the Monroe property, now overrun with bramble and brush. The house was gone, replaced by a sagging foundation and a well covered in rotting planks. A single rusted horseshoe hung nailed to a tree nearby. He descended into what remained of the cellar. It was damp, smelled of earth and rust. There were faint markings along the interior stone. Not writing, not scratches, but grooves. Circular, deliberate. He brought a magnetized compass. It spun in erratic bursts whenever placed against the far wall. The metal casing of his flashlight warmed in his hand without explanation, and in the silence of the room, beneath the noise of dripping water and shifting earth, he heard something faint. A low hum, metallic, steady. Joseph left that night and did not return. His notes ended abruptly in late 1986. He died in a house fire in March of the following year. His manuscript was never published. The Clervion box was returned to the archives and again forgotten. But not entirely. In 2015, a podcast producer named Mara Ellison began developing a historical audio series about lost towns of America. In the course of her research, she discovered the unpublished manuscript of Joseph Mallory, stored in a private collection held by the Mallory estate. It contained everything: the newspaper clippings, transcriptions of interviews, maps, sketches, photographs of the Monroe cellar walls. And at the center of it all, the disappearances of the 3 children in Clervion, Illinois. She traveled to Clervion that autumn. The road into town was barely passable. Weeds cracked through the asphalt. The air smelled old. Abandoned homes leaned against each other like drunks trying to stay upright. And though no one else was seen, she found fresh prints in the dirt near the former church. Child-sized, barefoot. The fields were quiet again. By the time Mara Ellison returned from her first trip to Clervion in the fall of 2015 Goda, her hands were shaking. She didn't say much during the drive back to her motel in Greenville, a town почти в 30 milach к югу. Her audio recorder was filled with static, broken by occasional clicking sounds, too rhythmic for mechanical noise, but not recognizable as anything natural. One clip, taken near the edge of the eastern forest, included a faint sound at the very end, a metallic ring, clear and deliberate, like a distant chime being struck once, then silence. Mara didn't tell anyone what she'd found. She worked alone, by habit and by choice. In her motel room, she unrolled copies of Joseph Mallory's original research. She pinned them to the walls, filling the space with photocopies of old maps, scribbled timelines, hand-drawn portraits, and newspaper fragments that hadn't seen light in Desatellita. One clipping in particular caught her eye. Dated July 6, 1949 Goda. It described the failed town meeting following the third disappearance. What stood out was a name listed in the minutes: Enoch Talbot, age 86, former schoolmaster. Talbot had reportedly interrupted Sheriff Klein's address, yelling that the bells were a warning and that they never should have plowed the east fields. He was removed from the room by townspeople before being questioned. 2 weeks later, he died in his sleep. No family. His property, a small cabin half a mile east of town, was abandoned and later condemned after reports of structural instability. No further records of him were found, no birth certificate, no family name in the census of 1900. Mara noted the coordinates listed for Talbot's cabin and made a decision. She returned to Clervion 3 days later, this time with more equipment: an analog field recorder, a vintage Polaroid camera, a mechanical compass, and a notebook. GPS devices, she had learned quickly, were useless in Clervion. The signals scrambled inexplicably at the town limits. Her rented car began to experience electrical glitches. The dashboard clock reversed twice. The radio, though turned off, let out a brief hiss before falling silent. The walk to where Talbot's home once stood was uneventful at first. The trees grew closer together here, thicker, darker. The wind passed strangely, carrying with it an odor she couldn't identify, like old iron and turned soil. As she reached the clearing, she found no trace of a cabin. No beams, no foundation, nothing to mark where the building might have stood. But in the center of the space, partially covered in vines, was a narrow trench, straight and deliberate, cutting through the ground in a perfect line from north to south. She stepped closer and noticed small objects scattered along the trench. Polished stones arranged in pairs, 2 by 2, 12 pairs in total. Each stone was carved with deep lines, intersecting in angular shapes, none that matched tribal markings or known alphabets. She took photos. When she touched the stones, her palm tingled. The sensation was like touching vibrating glass. Though the air was still, Mara returned to her car at dusk. The static in her recorder was louder now. Her Polaroids showed the stones, but in each frame, the background trees appeared blurred, as if in motion, even though she had held the camera steady. One photograph was completely black, though taken in daylight. She didn't remember taking it. Later that night, while reviewing her field notes in the motel, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was hoarse, male, and slow. "It's in the soil," the man said. "You stir the ground, you wake it up, same as before." He hung up before she could respond. The motel staff denied connecting any calls. The next morning, Mara visited the county clerk's office in Greenville. She requested access to the land sale records for the Clervion area from the late 18 i 19 Vikov. The clerk, a tired woman in her shesty desatich, gave her a curious glance. "You're not the first one," she said quietly. "Years back, a man came asking the same." Mara asked if she meant Joseph Mallory. The woman shook her head. "Older, said his father had seen something buried near the Sullivan property. Kept asking about iron bells." She was given access to the archives. Most deeds were standard: land sold to farmers, ranchers, families escaping the city. But a single entry from the year 1892 caught her attention. A parcel of land on the east edge of Clervion had been purchased by an entity called the Bell Commission. No individuals listed, no local address. The deed included a clause: Ground not to be disturbed deeper than 3 feet. Exceptions require written request to charter authorities. No follow-up records existed. No subsequent ownership transfers. The commission was never incorporated in state filings. The land, according to a faded map overlay, included what would later become the Monroe family's homestead. This changed everything. Mara returned once more to Clervion, this time on foot, through the old Monroe Trail. The well still stood, covered by rotting wood and rusted nails. Around it, the air had a pressure, like before a thunderstorm. She removed the planks and peered inside. Darkness. She dropped a rock. 1 second, 2, 3. Then, a sharp metallic clang. Something was still there. She rigged her field microphone to lower on a line, slowly. As it descended, the static intensified. Then, for a brief moment, it cleared, and a sound came through. Not words, not speech. It was rhythmic. A slow, deliberate knocking, 3 times, then silence. She pulled the microphone up. The casing was hot, and it smelled, the same as the trees by Talbot's clearing. Turned soil, iron. Mara didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the black horizon beyond the tree line. She kept the recorder on her lap. At precisely 3 chasa, sorok sem, minut nochi, it clicked on by itself. The same rhythmic knock played. This time, it repeated, knock, knock, knock. Then again, knock, knock, knock. 3 sets of 3. As if something below had heard her. By the spring of 2016, Mara Ellison no longer considered herself a journalist. Somewhere along the way, her investigation had shifted from a story to a pursuit. She didn't care about podcast listeners or production schedules anymore. She lived in isolation in a rented cabin in Charlotte Hill, 15 miles west of Clervion, surrounded by maps, magnetic tapes, and photocopies of documents from 70 years ago. She was no longer documenting, she was searching. In April, Mara managed to track down the last known living relative of the Monroe family. Greta James, the niece of Helen Monroe, who had lived in the house near the Eastern Woods until its destruction in 1951. Greta was in her 80s now, with translucent skin and clouded eyes. She refused to speak about Clervion during their first meeting. She kept her curtains closed, even during the day. But when Mara returned with a copy of the land inventory and a photograph of the carved stone ring found near the trench east of the town, something shifted in the old woman's face. She stared at the image for a long time, her mouth slightly open. Then she whispered, barely audibly, "They always came to the windows. Not the door. Not from the woods. The windows. Even when the windows didn't reflect. No faces. No light." Mara pressed her for more, but Greta became unresponsive, rocking in her chair, humming a tune that didn't have a melody. Mara noted every word. That phrase stuck with her for days when the windows didn't reflect. She went back to her files. In an archived insurance record from the summer of 1949, she found an odd entry for the Monroe residence. Non-reflective double-glazed panels, east wall only, imported from Indiana. Custom batch, order fulfilled June 4th. 4 panes, installed 3 weeks before the disappearances began. No other house in Clervion or the county had ever used glass like this. Why would a rural family install custom glass with non-reflective coating? Why only on one side of the house? And why in June of that particular year? The following day, Mara arranged to revisit the site. This time, she brought someone with her. William Hanks, a retired cemetery historian from the area who had spent the past 2 decades cataloging gravestones and funeral records from rural Illinois. He wasn't drawn by the disappearances. His interest lay in something stranger, double death dates. He led Mara to the old Shiloh Hill Cemetery just southwest of Clervion, where 6 children's graves sat in a line, half swallowed by overgrowth. Each stone bore a standard date of birth and death, matching public records, but underneath, carved in a fainter hand, Each grave had another line, symbols that looked like a mix of numbers and letters but didn't match any known alphabet. "I've asked every mason in the county," Hanks said, running his finger over one of the markings. "None of them did this, and no one knows who added them. Most appeared years after the burials, quietly, without announcement." Mara took detailed rubbings of the markings. That night, back at her cabin, she laid them next to the symbols from the stones found in the trench. The structure was similar, angular cuts, intersecting strokes. The spacing was precise. She spent hours comparing them, but at exactly 3:47 in the morning, the same time as the recorder incident weeks prior, all 4 Polaroids she had pinned to the wall fell at once. There was no draft, no vibration, and when she picked them up, the 4th image, a shot of one of the gravestones, had changed. Where once there was only overgrown grass and moss, now, faintly, barely visible, was a shape standing in the background. Long, thin, featureless. The head tilted. She tried to dismiss it as a chemical error, but the chill in her spine made it hard to breathe. 2 days later, she received a brown envelope. No return address. Inside was a single page torn from a field notebook, dated July 18, 1949. The handwriting was cramped but legible. At the top it read, "C. Danton, survey log, East Line, Site 9. Below were field measurements, all drawn in pencil. One entry stood out. Sunrise, 7:12 a.m. Reflections noted in 3 eastern windows. Unbroken surface, but no image cast. Attempted to record, plates fogged. Subject, woman in nightgown, unmoving, appeared inside pane for 27 seconds before vanishing. No woman found inside property. Sheriff advised no further observation. C. Danton was not listed in any police or construction records from Clervion. But in the margins of the page, a second hand had written, "Buried too shallow. Movement during thaw. Notify Talbot." Talbot again. Mara revisited the trench site with a field-strength magnetometer, an old military surplus device. As she swept the area, the needle jumped at irregular intervals. Metallic objects were buried at inconsistent depths, too shallow. She marked 3 locations and began digging by hand. At the 3rd site, only a foot below the surface, her shovel struck something flat and heavy. She cleared away the dirt and uncovered a metal sheet, rusted and scored, with bolts along one edge. It looked like the lid of a container, no larger than a child's coffin. She didn't open it. Not then. The air around her had changed. The forest had gone quiet, not just silent, but empty. No birds, no leaves stirring, no insects. She stood for minutes, unable to move, until the quiet was broken by a sound from deep in the woods, not from a direction, from everywhere. A crack, a metallic snap, like something under strain. Then, from the trees, a reflection. Brief, no more than a second. A window-like shimmer hung in midair, and behind it, blackness. She left everything and ran. Later that night, in the motel room, she played back her analog recorder from the site. Amid the crunch of soil and breath, there was something else, a voice, not hers, faint, distant. A whisper, repeated 4 times. "He sees through the glass. He sees through the glass." The voice sounded like a child's, but none of the missing children were ever found. October of 2016 brought windstorms to southern Illinois. Not unusual for the season, but something about their timing unsettled Mara Ellison. The trees around Charlotte Hills swayed with unnatural cadence, and during one such night, power was lost for 7 hours. When the lights returned, she found her wall of evidence, the photos, rubbings, and maps, had collapsed. The only thing still hanging was the rubbings of the gravestone symbols. Everything else lay in disarray. Her hands shook as she repinned the wall, but not from fear, from resolve. There was one lead left she hadn't pursued fully. A name that kept surfacing in peripheral records. Esther Caldwell, teacher at the Clervion Primary School from 1946 to 1950. Her name appeared in attendance logs for all 3 missing children. But what stood out wasn't her presence. It was what she'd written in a disciplinary journal found in the attic of the abandoned school building, recovered years earlier by preservationists but never examined thoroughly. In thick, looping handwriting, one entry stood out, dated July 5, 1949. J. Danner refused to go near Eastern Corridor, said, "The chair is back," claimed it turns to face him when no one looks. 2 others, Peter and Lyle, confirmed seeing it too. Wooden, straight back, 1 red thread tied around its leg. I checked. There is no such chair in the school. Peter Halley, one of the 3 missing children. Lyle Benson, another. She returned to the schoolhouse ruins, now fenced off, but easily accessed through a gap near the rear. The eastern wing had mostly collapsed, overtaken by ivy and soil. But Mara found the corridor described. Beneath a rotted doorway, she noticed something peculiar. A rusted circle pressed into the floorboards, as if the base of a chair had remained unmoved for years. Around one leg mark was the faded residue of red pigment, not thread. Paint. The chair had once been there. She took soil samples, photographs, and peeled back a warped floorboard. Tucked inside was a paper doll, hand-cut, with inked eyes and red dots for buttons. A child's toy. On the back, written in tiny letters, "He sits where the glass is thin." Mara pressed the paper to her chest. The phrasing matched the recorder voice from the trench. She returned to her cabin and began assembling a chronology. Times, places, symbols, objects. She started seeing a pattern that hadn't emerged before. All 3 children had mentioned furniture. Objects that changed position on their own. In one report, Peter Halley's mother claimed he had refused to sit at their kitchen table after claiming the chair moved when the window got dark. In another, Lyle Benson's sister wrote in a letter that Lyle stopped sleeping in his room because the dresser whispered. Objects, not people, not spirits. Things displaced. She called Dr. Harold Fincher, a cultural historian from Decatur who had studied indigenous symbology and oral traditions of the Illiniwek and Kickapoo peoples. When she showed him the gravestone carvings and the symbols from the trench, he paused before responding. "These are not words. They're placements, markings of transition. What you have here is not a language. It's a diagram, a layout, possibly ritualistic." When asked what kind, he responded carefully. Not a welcoming one. He showed her one symbol in particular, a sideways figure resembling an hourglass, but made of 3 loops. It appeared twice on the gravestones, once on the ring, and faintly etched onto the baseboard of the old chair mark at the school. It's similar to the broken circle motif, a design used to denote passage points. "Temporary openings," Mara asked. "Between what and what?" Fincher didn't answer. Instead, he folded the rubbings and asked for copies. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, turning the paper doll over and over. And at precisely 3:47, the clock on her wall stopped. Again. This time, she didn't check the Polaroids. She walked to the window. Outside in the clearing sat a chair, wooden, straight back, covered in dew, and tied around the front leg, a strand of red thread flapping in the wind. She hadn't placed it there. When she stepped outside, the wind stopped. The air froze. Her breath hung in the air as if held by something unseen. She approached the chair. It was facing her, upright, unmoving. She lifted it. It was heavier than it should have been. And underneath it, pressed into the soft earth, was another paper doll, identical to the first. But this time, the inked eyes had been scratched out and written on its back. The glass cracked once. It will again. She took the chair inside and locked the doors. 3 days later, she met with local archivist Charles Danvers, who had retrieved a bundle of papers from the Clervion Sheriff's Department, confiscated in 1952 during the disbanding of the old force. Inside was a worn folder labeled Unclassified, Monroe Property, July-August 1949, Witness Account, F. Talbot. Talbot again. In the statement, dated August 14, 1949, Officer Franklin Talbot recounted a nightly patrol near the Monroe property. What he wrote could not be easily dismissed. At 03:27 hours, I saw a glow behind the tree line. I followed it east. No sound. Just this low hum like teeth grinding. When I got to the Monroe windows, I swear on the badge, the glass wasn't showing the woods. It showed a room. My room. Same lamp, same chair, same photograph of Sarah. But something was sitting in my chair. It was looking at me. No face, but I swear it was smiling. I fired one shot. Glass didn't break. I left. Didn't go back. In a second handwriting, likely a supervisor's, someone had written across the top, "No further reports. Let it lie." Mara stared at that sentence for a long time. She looked at the photo from her own kitchen again. The chair, the thread. And she realized something. The chair wasn't just showing up. It was returning. It was the 29th of October, 2016. 67 years and 90 days since Peter Halley, Lyle Benson, and Hannah Monroe vanished without a trace from Clervion, Illinois. The air was unnaturally still that morning, and when Mara Ellison woke, she found the power dead again. Not just in her cabin, across the entire grid. No radio, no phone, no noise. She didn't panic. She knew what was coming. She had spent the last 3 weeks remapping every known anomaly tied to the children's disappearances. The gravestones, the trench, the schoolhouse corridor, the Monroe residence, and the eastern woods. When connected on a map, they formed a near-perfect pentagon. Not symbolic, spatial, deliberate. And at its center, an unmarked clearing, half a mile east of the original Monroe property. Nothing was ever built there. No records of any structure. No soil disturbance noted by surveyors since 1940. But on aerial photographs, Mara found something else. In 2 frames taken 6 months apart, one in late 1948, one in early 1949, the clearing had changed. Trees that were once there no longer cast shadows. Not that the trees were gone. They were still visible. But from above, no shade, no contrast, just shapes without weight, like a window that didn't reflect. On the final day of her investigation, Mara went there. She carried no camera, no recorder, only a notebook, a compass, and the 2 paper dolls. It was just before dusk when she reached the center of the clearing. What she found was a circle of wooden chairs. 5. Old. Each facing outward. Each with a strand of red thread around one leg. The circle was unbroken, yet the grass within it had not grown. The ground was bare, packed tight, like something heavy had stood there. Not for hours, for years. Mara took her notebook and stood in the center. Her hands trembled. She placed one of the paper dolls on the ground and waited. At 3:47, the wind rose, sharp, directionless, not through the trees, under them. A low tremor shook the earth, and then silence, the kind that bends inward. Not empty, but watching. And then the air changed, not the temperature, the texture. It felt as if someone had removed the world and placed a thinner version in its place. The sky paled, losing its warmth. The tree line wavered, and across the circle of chairs, Mara saw them. 3 children. Not walking, not floating, simply there. Peter, Lyle, Hannah, still 7 years old. Clothes faded, faces neutral, their feet not touching the ground. And behind them, not a figure, not a being, a shape. Towering, not black, but the absence of color entirely. Elongated, like smoke with edges. Not moving, but slowly becoming. It stood just behind the tree line, its form bleeding in and out of view. Not a ghost, not a shadow, a reflection without a source. Mara tried to speak, but her voice vanished in her throat. The children did not cry. They did not blink. They simply turned, all 3, to face the shape. The grass beneath their feet rippled, and one by one they stepped backward, into it. No sound, No resistance, as if they were returning to where they'd never truly left. And then the light returned. Not bright, not harsh, just light. The clearing emptied. The chairs remained, but one, the chair to Mara's left, now held a door. Not paper. Fabric, stitched with red thread. The eyes were blank, the limbs slightly frayed. She took it, and she walked home in silence. The official record still states that Peter Halley, Lyle Benson, and Hannah Monroe disappeared without a trace in the summer of 1949. No foul play determined, no bodies recovered. The town of Clervion remains depopulated, though not formally abandoned. The last census listed 11 residents. No investigations remain open. No articles are published. And yet, every 3rd of July, at exactly 3:47 in the morning, someone, anonymous, places 3 white flowers on the edge of the old Monroe property. And every year, those flowers do not wilt. They remain untouched by weather or wind, just standing, still quiet, like the chairs, like the glass, like the things that only appear when the world forgets to reflect.